Guys, have you read Star of Acre? This isn't sponsored at all, but dang, I just finished it, and it was the best horror novel I've read in years. Very sad, very eerie. I recommend it. Oh, yeah, today I've got backpacking stories for you. So maybe if you're brave enough to take up a backpack and go for a hike, toss a copy of Star of Acre in your pack. Tonight, there will be European folklore monsters, secret cursed places, and childhood trauma. Enjoy. Don't forget to send me your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. Now, let's begin. Disturbing Wolf Thing from Recent Searcher. I was about halfway through my trek along the Great Divide Trail in the Canadian Rockies. It was late August. The plan was to hike the whole thing, from Waterton Lakes National Park all the way up to Kakwa Provincial Park. It was a trip I'd been dreaming about for years. I'm from Vancouver, but I'd never really explored much of the wilderness in my own backyard. Always too busy with work and life and all that. But I'd finally saved up enough vacation time and money to take a couple months off and just disappear into the mountains. That particular day had been rough. I'd been pushing myself hard, trying to make up for lost time after waiting out a nasty storm a few days back. My legs were aching and my feet were blistered, and I was starting to run low on supplies. I knew I'd have to detour off the trail soon to resupply, but I was hoping to push on for one more day. As evening started to set in, I realized I'd miscalculated. I was nowhere near my planned campsite, and the terrain was too steep and rocky to safely set up camp. From there, I spotted a faint light in the distance, off to the east of the trail. Had to be a farm or maybe a ranger station or something, I thought. So I figured I'd head that way, see if I could camp on the edge of their property for the night to be safe. Worst case, maybe they'd let me refill my water. It took me about an hour to reach the place. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a farmhouse. One of those old two-story jobs that looked like it had been there for generations. There was a barn off to one side, and I could see a few outlying buildings that I guessed were sheds or workshops. The whole place was surrounded by fields, with the forest pressing in close on all sides. I was about to head up to the house when something made me hesitate. Can't really explain it, to be honest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and something just felt wrong. You spend enough time in the wilderness, I guess you develop a sort of sixth sense for danger. This felt like that, but different, more unsettling somehow. And then I saw it. Something that at first I thought was a person. There was a figure standing by one of the ground floor windows of the farmhouse. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it was way too big to be human, and the shape was all wrong. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, covered in what looked like shaggy dark fur. But it wasn't shaped like a bear. It was standing on 2 legs, body hunched forward in a way that looked unnatural. Its arms, if you could call them that, were long and ended in what looked like huge clawed hands. I froze, afraid to move. The creature had not seen or sensed me yet. It was completely focused on that window. As I watched, it leaned in closer, pressing its face against the glass. And then, God, I can barely bring myself to describe it. It began to lick the window. Long, slow strokes of its tongue against the glass. The sound carried clearly in the still night air, this wet, raspy noise that made my skin crawl. I'm not sure how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, before finally, the creature pulled back from the window. It turned its head, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought I'd been spotted. It let out a low rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, then loped off into the darkness of the surrounding forest. I waited until I was sure it was gone, then practically ran up to the farmhouse. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely knock on the door. A middle-aged man answered, looking understandably confused to find a disheveled hiker on his doorstep at night. I opened my mouth, ready to spill everything I'd just seen, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what I'd witnessed without sounding completely insane? Instead, I forced a sheepish smile and said, "I'm so sorry to bother you this late. I was hiking out here and I got myself completely turned around. Could you possibly point me in the direction of the nearest town?" The man's confusion turned to concern. "You're pretty far from any marked trails, son. Everything all right?" I nodded, perhaps a bit too eagerly. "Yeah, I took a wrong turn somewhere. I lost track of time." He studied me for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder into the house. "Look, it's pitch black out there, and the terrain's treacherous if you don't know it. Why don't you come in for a bit? My wife just put on some coffee." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But another part, well, I couldn't just leave without saying something, could I? And I really did need to get my bearings. "That's really kind of you. Thank you," I said, stepping inside. The warmth hit me immediately, making me realize how cold I'd been. The man introduced himself as John. He led me to a cozy kitchen where his wife, Sarah, was indeed brewing some coffee. She gave me a warm smile and set about pouring me a cup. As I sat there, hands wrapped around the steaming mug, I wrestled with what to say. I couldn't tell them the exact truth, but I couldn't say nothing either. Actually, I saw something before I came to your door," I started, my heart pounding. "I'm not sure how to say this, but, well, I think I saw a strange man peering through one of your ground floor windows." John and Sarah exchanged a look. It wasn't the reaction I expected, not shock or fear, but more like resignation. "Which window?" John asked, his voice low. I pointed in the general direction. "Over there, I think, on the side of the house." Sarah's face paled. "That's Emily's room," she whispered. John stood up abruptly. "I'll go check on her, and I'll have a look around outside." As he left, Sarah turned to me. "Thank you for telling us. We've had issues with trespassers before. Not sure why, but this area attracts all sorts of strange folk." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and now wondering if I counted as one of those strange folk. I wanted to say more to her, to warn her about what I'd really seen, but I just couldn't. John came back a few minutes later. "Emily's fine," he said to Sarah. "Sleeping soundly. Didn't see anyone outside, but I'll do a more thorough check in the morning. They offered to let me sleep in the spare bedroom. It was next to their bedroom, so they could keep an eye on me. And John agreed to stay up anyway, in case that man came back, but also probably because he wanted to keep an eye on me too." I gratefully accepted the offer, but truthfully, I spent most of the night staying up and talking to John, discussing goings-on in the woods, what he does for a living, how life was out on the farm. In the morning, John gave me directions to the nearest town, where I could resupply. I thanked them for their hospitality and set off, glad to put some distance between myself and whatever I'd seen the night before. Wish I could say that was the end of it, that I finished my hike and went back to a normal life, chalking the whole thing up to dancing shadows in the night, or maybe just a really big bear. But I still couldn't shake it off. It nagged at me, demanded answers. About 6 months later, I found myself driving through that way and decided I would drop by the farm to pay them a visit. I told myself I was just being thorough, tying up loose ends before I wrote up my trail journal. But deep down, I think I wanted to make sure that everyone there was okay, and I was extremely grateful for how kind they were. I don't think I could have walked any further in those woods in the dark, knowing that something like that lived out there. The farm looked different in the daytime, peaceful and ordinary. John seemed surprised to see me, but he invited me in for coffee. We chatted for a bit about nothing in particular, the weather, how my hike had gone, that sort of thing. At a certain point, I asked how Emily was doing. John got real quiet. He looked out the window for a long moment. Emily was a sickly child. Weak lungs, the doctor said. To be frank with you, she passed away in her sleep only a week after you were here. I was taken aback. Didn't know what to say. My God, I'm so sorry, I managed to finally say. It felt inadequate. The thing is, John continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you mind if I share something strange? John asked. I nodded. Thing is, the night before she died, Emily told us she'd been having dreams. Said there was a big dog that would come to her window at night. Said it would lick the glass and tell her not to be afraid. I only want to bring it up because it reminds me of the man you saw at her window that night. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. John continued. She said it spoke to her in her dreams, told her it would take her somewhere she wouldn't be sick anymore. He looked at me, his eyes starting to shine with unshed tears. Been wondering if it was the fever talking. I think about it a lot lately, that maybe these dreams she had helped her to pass on. We sat in silence for a long while after that. What could I even say? Eventually, I made my excuses, thanked him profusely again for the coffee and for the kindness his family showed me that night, then left. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that creature at the window. Had it really been there for Emily, despite how disturbing it looked? Was it some kind of spirit guide? Or was it something darker? Something that caused the girl to die? I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since then, and I still don't know. But I've had plenty of nightmares about it ever since. I'm asking anyone and everyone who hears this story or reads it, what do you think it could have been? A benign creature or spirit trying to help the little girl, knowing that she was about to pass? Or some sort of evil monster that cursed the girl to die? I'd gone missing. From Terrific Fluoride. I'd gone backpacking through northern Michigan. I had just graduated college and wanted to do a solo trip to clear my head before starting the job hunt. I'm originally from the suburbs of Chicago, so I wasn't exactly an experienced outdoorsman. But I'd done some camping as a kid, and I figured I could handle a week-long trek through the Hiawatha National Forest. Looking back, I was pretty naive and underprepared. I had decent gear, a good backpack, tent, sleeping bag, etc. But I had never really done any serious backcountry hiking before. I plotted out a route that would take me on a big loop through some of the more remote parts of the forest, figuring I'd cover about 10 miles a day. In retrospect, that was way too ambitious for my skill level. The first couple of days were actually great. The weather was perfect. Clear skies and temperatures in the low 70s. I was making decent time and really enjoying the solitude. There's something magical about being alone in nature, surrounded by nothing but trees and birdsong. I would stop occasionally to filter water from streams or take photos of particularly scenic spots. At night, I would make camp, eat some trail mix or dehydrated meals, and I would fall asleep to the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was on the third night that things started to get weird. I had hiked a little farther than usual that day, pushing myself to reach a small lake I'd marked on my map as a good campsite. By the time I got there, the sun was already dipping below the tree line. I quickly set up my tent and got a small fire going, wanting to eat and get settled before dark really set in. As I sat by the fire, heating up some soup, I had this sudden feeling of being watched. You know that prickly sensation at the back of your neck? Like that, but more intense. I looked around, scanning the trees at the edge of my little clearing, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, I could not shake the feeling. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind. But as the night wore on, the feeling only intensified. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. The forest sounds seemed to change too. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs went quiet, replaced by this eerie stillness, which was only broken by the occasional snapping of a twig in the dark. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I'd start to drift off, I would jerk awake, convinced I'd heard footsteps or breathing just outside my tent. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted and on edge. Part of me wanted to pack up and hightail it back to civilization, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd come out here for an adventure after all, so I shouldered my pack and pressed on. The next day was odd. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but something felt off about the forest. The trees seemed denser, the shadows deeper. I'd check my maps and compass, only to find that I didn't seem to be making much progress, not as much as I should. The landmarks I was looking for never seemed to materialize. It was as if the landscape itself was subtly shifting around me. By late afternoon, I had to admit I was lost. None of the terrain matched my map anymore. I thought about trying to backtrack, but I couldn't even be sure which direction I'd come from. The sun was hidden behind a thick canopy, and my compass was spinning wildly, the needle swinging in circles. As I began to panic, I stumbled into another clearing. That's when I saw it for the first time. It was, I don't even know how to describe it right, but I'll do my best. It was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, impossibly tall, about 8 feet or more, and it was thin, like a shadow given 3D form. It didn't seem to have distinct features, just a vague humanoid shape that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched. I don't know how I knew that, since I couldn't see any eyes, but I swear I felt its gaze boring into me. After a while, I backed away slowly. The figure remained motionless. As soon as I reached the tree line, I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. As I lay there, gasping for breath, the shadows lengthened around me. Night was falling again, and I was nowhere near any state to make camp. I knew I should get up, find water, set up a tent, but I was paralyzed by fear and exhaustion and confusion. That's when I heard it. It was like this chittering sound, a high-pitched insectile noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and underneath it, a deeper sound, a rhythmic thumping like massive footsteps getting closer. I scrambled to my feet, all fatigue forgotten in a fresh wave of adrenaline. I picked a direction at random and ran again, quieter this time, trying to listen for pursuit over the sound of my own ragged breathing. I'm not sure how long I fled through the darkening forest. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The trees began to look twisted into unnatural shapes. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy and uneven. At some point, I became aware that the chittering had stopped. The forest was once more deathly quiet. I slowed to a walk, straining my ears for any sign of danger. And then I saw the lights. Ahead of me, weaving between the trees, were tiny points of bluish-white light. They moved like fireflies on a mission. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run the other way, I found myself drawn towards them. As I got closer, I realized the lights were coming from small ethereal figures flitting through the air. They seemed to take notice of me. They began to circle around, and, unbelievably, they seemed to form a path through the woods. Some part of me knew I shouldn't follow, but I was beyond rational thought at that point. I stumbled after the lights, pushed onwards by equal parts curiosity and desperation. I was led into a meadow, where the trees began to have these strange symbols carved into their bark. I stopped for a moment, reaching out to touch one of the symbols. As my fingers brushed the rough bark, the world seemed to shift, or maybe I just blacked out. The next thing I remember was opening my eyes, and the lights were gone, and everything felt, well, normal again. In fact, my surroundings had changed. In the distance I saw lights, different lights. These were man-made, the outskirts of a small town that was not there before. I made my way there in a hurry, finding the nearest street. People were looking at me strangely. I'm assuming my appearance didn't help. I had to have been filthy and scratched up and wild-eyed. I found a convenience store and went inside. I went right up to the counter and asked, "Excuse me." My voice sounded hoarse. "Can you tell me where I am?" He gave me the name of a town I'd never heard of, an estate hundreds of miles from where I'd started my hike. "What day is it?" I asked. I dreaded the answer. When he told me, my knees felt weak. Somehow, impossibly, over 2 weeks had passed since I'd entered that forest. 2 weeks that I had no memory of. The convenience store let me use the phone, and I called my parents. They were hysterical. Apparently, I'd been reported missing after failing to return from my trip on schedule. Search parties had combed the area where I was supposed to be hiking, but found no trace of me. I never did come up with a satisfactory explanation for what happened. The official story is that I got lost in the woods and wandered in a delusional state for 2 weeks before finding my way back to civilization. I know that's not true, but it's easier than trying to explain the unexplainable. I've since gone hiking again. I still do go hiking on occasion, but I don't go alone anymore, and I never go in too deep. Nowadays, no matter what I do, it feels like I'm always catching a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees, and I wonder if that's PTSD from my experience. The moment I step foot into woods anywhere, I always feel watched. The Momentous Hill, from Jerry Gargamel. It's funny how some memories from childhood stick with you. Most of the time, I can barely remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. But this one night from when I was 11, it's burned into my brain like it happened last night. This was back in '92. I was in the 5th grade. My best friends were Tommy and Jesse. Tommy lived out on the edge of town, where the suburbs started giving way to farmland. His house backed up to this big open field that led to a hill that we called the Mound. It wasn't much of a hill, really, but when you're a kid, everything seems bigger. It was a Friday night. We were having a sleepover at Tommy's place. But this wasn't going to be any ordinary sleepover. No, we had plans, big plans. We were going to be real adventurers. You see, Tommy's parents had finally agreed to let us camp out on top of the mound. Well, sort of. We could go up there with our sleeping bags and backpacks, hang out until 9 p.m., then come back to sleep in the house. It wasn't exactly roughing it in the wilderness, but to us, it was the height of adventure. We'd been planning this for weeks. Our school backpacks were stuffed with all the essentials: flashlights, comic books, enough snacks to feed a small army, and of course our trusty Swiss Army knives. We felt like real explorers, ready to tame the wild half-mile between Tommy's back porch and the top of the mound. Tommy's mom made us sandwiches for dinner, reminding us for the 100th time to be careful and stay together. We nodded impatiently, eager to get started on our grand expedition. As soon as we finished eating, we were out the door, our backpacks weighing us down as we set off across the field. The sun was just starting to set as we began our trek. The mound loomed ahead of us, awaiting us under a darkened sky. Jesse was the worrier of the group. He kept glancing back at Tommy's house, which was growing smaller behind us. "You're not scared, are you?" I teased. Jesse puffed up. "No way. I was just making sure we're going the right direction." Tommy laughed. "It's a straight line, dummy. We can't get lost." We continued on, the tall grass of the field giving way to the steeper, rockier slope of the mound. It wasn't a difficult climb, but we took our time anyway, pretending we were scaling some great mountain peak. When we finally reached the top, we were out of breath, but grinning from ear to ear. "We made it!" Tommy crowed, dropping his backpack and raising his arms up in victory. "We've conquered the mound." Jesse and I cheered along with him, caught up in the moment. We felt like kings of the world, looking down at the twinkling lights of our small town spread out below us. We then set about making our camp, which mostly consisted of laying out our sleeping bags in a rough circle, piling up our snacks in the middle. Tommy had brought a small battery-powered lantern, which we placed in the center of the circle. It cast a warm glow over the little campsite. As the last traces of daylight faded from the sky, we broke into our snacks and started to tell ghost stories. You know, the usual stuff kids tell around a campfire. Hook-handed killers, vengeful spirits. Jesse was in the middle of a particularly creepy tale about a babysitter and a killer hiding upstairs, when Tommy went still. Then he spoke. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look up there." We followed his gaze up to the night sky. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just stars twinkling like they always did. But then I saw it, a light brighter than any star, moving slowly across the sky. "It's just a plane," Jesse said, but he didn't sound convinced. The light was moving too slowly to be a plane, and it was getting bigger, brighter, much brighter. "Maybe it's a meteor," I suggested, my voice shaking a bit. But it wasn't like any meteor I'd ever seen or read about. The light kept growing, from a pinprick to the size of a dime, then a quarter. It was so bright it hurt to look at directly, but we couldn't take our eyes off of it. That's when things got fuzzy. I remember the light getting so bright, it seemed to fill the whole sky. I remember a humming sound so low, I felt it more than heard it. And I remember feeling very, very sleepy all of a sudden. The next thing I knew, someone was shaking me awake. I opened my eyes to find Tommy's dad leaning over me, looking worried. "You kids okay?" he asked, helping me sit up. "We've been calling for you for about an hour." I looked around, disoriented. Tommy and Jesse were just waking up too, looking as confused as I felt. Our campsite was a mess, sleeping bags twisted, snacks scattered everywhere. The lantern was off, its batteries apparently dead. "What happened?" Tommy asked, his voice groggy. His dad sighed. No idea. He had us worried sick. Why didn't he come back at 9 like we agreed? We looked at each other, baffled. How could it already be past 9? It felt like we just laid down in our sleeping bags only a few minutes ago. We must have fallen asleep, Jesse said, but he didn't sound sure. Tommy's dad helped us pack up our things and led us back down the mound. As we walked, I was trying to piece together what had happened. The ghost stories, the light in the sky, and then nothing. It was like someone had just erased a few hours of my memory. What time had we arrived at the mound? And it was already past 9? It didn't make sense. When we got back to Tommy's house, his mom was waiting for us on the porch. She looked mad at first, then relief washed over her face when she saw us. She hugged each of us in turn, then sent us off to get ready for bed. As I was brushing my teeth, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and froze. There, just behind my ear, was a small, perfectly round bruise. I hadn't noticed it before, and I had no idea how I'd gotten it. When I asked Tommy and Jesse later, they both found similar marks on themselves. Tommy on his neck, Jesse on his shoulder. We tried to talk about what happened, but none of us could make sense of it. We agreed to keep it to ourselves. Who was going to believe us? The next morning, Tommy's parents seemed to have chalked up the whole incident to us being irresponsible kids who fell asleep and lost track of time. We didn't correct them. How could we explain something we didn't understand ourselves? Life went on, and for a while we didn't talk about that night on the mound. But things had changed. We had changed. Jesse suddenly became obsessed with UFOs and aliens, spending hours in the library reading every book he could find on the topic. Tommy, on the other hand, refused to even look at the mound. He kept his bedroom curtains closed at night and would change the channel if anything about aliens came on TV. As for me, I found myself watching the sky more often, especially at night. I'd wake up sometimes, heart racing, convinced I'd seen a bright light outside my window. But it was always just the moon, or a streetlight, or me waking from a dream. About a month after our camping trip, Tommy called me in the middle of the night. He was whispering, his voice shaking. "It's back," he said. "The light. It's over the mound right now." I rushed to my window, peering out into the darkness. I couldn't see the mound from my house, but the sky in that direction did seem brighter than it was supposed to be. "What do we do?" I asked. "Nothing," Tommy replied. "We pretend we never saw it. We never talk about this again, okay?" I agreed, wondering why he even called me then, but I couldn't help feeling like we were making a mistake, like we were ignoring something important. The years went by, and we grew up. During high school, Jesse moved away. His family relocated for his dad's job. Tommy and I drifted apart, as childhood friends sometimes do. Every now and then, I might run into Tommy during one of my college breaks. Whenever I heard from Jesse again, he was still very much into UFOs, but in a more academic way. He was studying astronomy, he told me, hoping to work for SETI one day. Tommy, though, well, Tommy never got over that night. He joined the military right out of high school, saying he wanted to be as far from the mound as possible. Eventually, he got his wish, and I stopped seeing him during those college breaks I mentioned. I guessed he made it somewhere overseas, or to a different state to do training. I tried to put it all behind me. I told myself it was simply a weird childhood experience, one possibly fueled by too many sci-fi movies and wild imaginations. Even so, I wonder. I can't help but feel I'm lying to myself. I've never gone back to the mound. Not sure I could, even if I wanted to. Last I heard, they built a subdivision there, turning our childhood adventure spot into a cluster of cookie-cutter houses. But part of me is glad. At least kids won't be camping up there anymore, risking, well, whatever it was we encountered. but it also feels like I lost something important. It feels like there was a mystery there, something bigger than us, and we just walked away from it. Maybe we were made to walk away from it. I don't know. Maybe I should finally give it a rest, stop thinking about it. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved after all. I'll leave you with this. Sometimes I still check behind my ear, half expecting to see that perfectly round bruise again. And whenever I look up at the night sky, I feel like something might be looking back. Strigoi, or Something Else. From Eldin Creature 1991. I'm an anthropology student, or I was back then. I had this brilliant idea to spend a summer exploring some of the more off-the-beaten-path areas I could find, looking for remnants of old folklore and traditions. A romantic notion, right? A young American girl wandering through the countryside collecting quaint stories from picturesque villages. Yeah. I'd been making my way through Romania for about 2 weeks. It was late June, hot as heck during the day, but the nights could still get pretty chilly. I'd just left Brasov and was heading towards some smaller villages in the Carpathian Mountains. My plan was to spend a few days in each place, talk to the locals, maybe record some of their stories if they'd let me. The trouble started in this tiny village. I won't say the name of it out of respect for the people there. It was the kind of place, though, that probably hadn't changed much in the last century. No more than a few dozen houses, a small church, and a single store that seemed to sell everything from bread to farm tools. The locals were polite but reserved, eyeing me with a mix of curiosity and wariness. I managed to rent a room in one of the houses on the outskirts of the village. The old woman who owned it didn't speak much English, but between my broken Romanian and a lot of gesturing, we worked it out. The room was small and sparse, just a bed, a chair, and a rickety old wardrobe. But it had a window that looked out over the forest behind the house, and I remember thinking how beautiful it was, all those trees stretching out into the dark. That very first night, I was awakened by a sound. It was faint, but definitely there, like nails gently scraping against glass. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked at the window. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A face, maybe? But pale, too pale, with eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was just a dream, or maybe an owl or some other nocturnal animal. Even so, I didn't sleep much after that. The following day, I tried to ask the locals about folklore relating to creatures of the forest. Most of them clammed up as soon as I broached the subject. But one old man, after a few glasses of homemade plum brandy, started to tell me about the Strigoi. Now, I'd read about Strigoi in my research. They're a kind of Romanian vampire ghost hybrid. Spirits of the dead that can become corporeal. But the way this old man talked about them, he wasn't really recounting a fairy tale. There was real fear in his voice. He told me that Strigoi were drawn to the living, especially outsiders, that they would watch from the forest, waiting for an invitation to enter someone's home. "They cannot come in unless invited," he said, tapping the side of his nose knowingly. "But they are clever. They can trick you." I nodded and thanked him for the story. I went back to my room and laughed it off. But that night, the scratching came again. This time I was sure that I wasn't dreaming. It was real, and it was coming from the window. I didn't look. I couldn't bring myself to. I just lay there, frozen, listening to that gentle scraping sound. It went on for what felt like hours, and all the while, I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. And not just watched, studied, like whatever was out there was trying to figure out how to get into me. Just before dawn, I heard a voice, soft, barely a whisper, but clear as day.
"Let me in. I'm so cold out here."
I'd like to say I was brave, that I got up, threw open the curtains, and confronted whatever was out there. But the truth is, I was terrified. I buried my head under the pillow and prayed for morning to come. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bags and left. I didn't even say goodbye to the old woman who owned the house. I just left some money on the table and practically ran to the nearest bus stop. I spent the rest of my trip in cities, surrounded by people and electric lights. I told myself I'd imagine the whole thing. It was just stress or an overactive imagination, brought on by all the folklore discussion and legends I'd been studying. But to this very day, I still remember that voice, and it's clear as day. I keep my curtains closed now. The Echoes in the Alps. From one backpacker. Let me tell you about the weirdest crap that happened to me while backpacking. This was about 2 years ago. I was doing a solo trek through the Alps. I was halfway through a 3-week hike across the French and Swiss Alps. I had done my research, had all the right gear, even splurged on one of those fancy satellite phones, in case things went horribly wrong. Fat lot of good that did me, though, but we'll get to that. It was day 10, I think. I had just crossed over into Switzerland, planning to spend the night at this little mountain hut I'd read about online. The weather had been absolute crap all day. Pouring rain, wind that nearly knocked me on my butt more than once. By the time I spotted the hut, I was soaked through and freezing my nadgers off. But here's the thing. When I got to the hut, it was already occupied. There was this old bloke sitting by the fire, pipe in hand, looking for all the world like he had stepped out of the 19th century. Wool trousers, suspenders, the works. I figured he was some kind of historical reenactor or something. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He just nodded and gestured for me to come in. I was too knackered to question it, just grateful to be out of the rain. We got to chatting as I dried off. His name was Klaus, he said, and he'd been waiting for someone to pass through. A bit odd, that, but I didn't think much of it just yet. As night fell, the storm outside got worse. Wind howled like a banshee. Rain lashed against the windows. That's when Klaus started to tell stories. Old alpine legends, he said. Tales of creatures that lived in the mountains, things that were neither man nor beast. I'm not one for ghost stories, usually. But truth be told, there was something about the way he told them. It was like he wasn't just reciting the stories, but remembering things he had personally seen. His eyes would go all distant, and his voice would drop to this intense whisper. Proper creepy it was. One story in particular stuck with me. He talked about echo spirits, beings that lived in the valleys and in caves, feeding off the echoes of human voices. According to Klaus, they could mimic any sound perfectly, luring unwary travelers to their doom. But how do you know if it's a real echo or a spirit? I asked, half joking. Klaus just looked at me, dead serious, and said, "When the echo calls your name, lad, that's when you run." I laughed it off, of course. Tried to, anyway. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake this weird feeling. Every crack of thunder, every howl of wind seemed to be saying something. I must have dozed off eventually. The next thing I knew, I was waking up to silence. The storm had finally passed, and early morning light was streaming through the windows. But Klaus, he was gone. No sign that he'd ever even been there. Not even an indent in the chair where he'd sat all night. I told myself maybe I dreamt the whole thing. Altitude sickness or something like that. Stuff can play tricks on your mind. I packed up my gear and set out, keen to make up for lost time. The day was clear and bright, a welcomed change from yesterday's downpour. I made good progress, following the trail up towards the next pass. I was enjoying my time and happy to be back out when I heard someone call my name. It echoed across the valley. I froze. It had to be my imagination, right? But then it came again, much clearer. It was my name, and it sounded like it was Klaus's voice. To me, it seemed to be coming from a cave opening just off the trail. Every instinct told me to run, but curiosity got the better of me. I edged closer to the cave, calling out a tentative, "Hello?" The echo that came back was not my voice. It was calling my name, but subtly. It sounded like it had an undertone of a dozen other voices. This hit a nerve, a deep, ingrained instinct that sent me running. I couldn't even think about it. I just turned and bolted back down the trail. But the worst part? The moment I ran, I began to hear rapid footsteps behind me. No, not footsteps. It was like a wave of sound that seemed to bounce off every rock and tree, and it followed me. I ran until my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare stop, not even then. Every time I slowed down, I would hear someone calling my name again, closer than before, mixed with snatches of different voices, sometimes even different languages. Eventually, I finally lost them or it, whatever it was, when I hit a river. I waded across, the freezing water shocking me back to my senses. When I made it to the other side, the echoes had faded. I made it to the nearest town in record time, abandoning the rest of my trek. I told everyone I'd gotten spooked out by the storm, and decided that the whole solo hiking thing was not for me after all. I couldn't exactly tell them the truth though, could I? They'd have thought I was around the bloody bend. I've done some digging since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Found some old folklore about alpine spirits, which prey on lone travelers. Even found a forum post or two of other hikers who had experienced similar things. Nothing conclusive, mind you, but enough to make me wonder. These days, I stick to group hikes in well-populated areas, and I will never ever answer if I hear my name on the wind again. Eerie happening in the Scottish Highlands, from Fan of the Spooks. I am American and I've got some Scottish heritage, so I'd always wanted to explore the Highlands. So I spent some time making my way north from Edinburgh, staying in hostels and small B&Bs along the way. By the time I reached the Northern Highlands, I was feeling pretty confident in my hiking abilities. I'd done some challenging trails and even wild camped a few times. So when I heard about this remote trail that wasn't on most tourist maps, I thought, why not? It was supposed to lead to this hidden loch that was supposedly one of the most beautiful spots in all of Scotland. The trailhead was near this tiny village. Honestly, it was more like a handful of houses clustered around a pub. I stopped in for a meal before heading out, figuring I'd stock up on some energy for the hike. The pub was one of those old cozy places, with a low ceiling and a fire crackling in the corner. It was pretty empty when I went in. Just a couple of old-timers nursing pints at the bar. I ordered some food and got to chatting with the bartender, telling him about my plans to hike out to the loch. The change in atmosphere was noticeable. The bartender got this weird look on his face. He tried to play it off, said something about the weather being unpredictable this time of year, but I could tell there was more to it. I pressed a bit, asking if there was something I should know about the trail. That's when one of the old-timers spoke up, apparently overhearing my conversation so far. "You don't want to be going out there, lad," he said. "That place is not right." I laughed at first, thinking they were just trying to scare the tourist. But that old man was dead serious. He told me that people had gone missing on that trail over the years. Not many, and not often, but enough to make the locals wary. "There's something out there," he said, his voice low. "Something old, something that doesn't like visitors." Now, I'm not usually one for superstition, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Still, I figured they were just being overprotective. I thanked them for the warning, but said I was still planning to go. The bartender sighed and said, "If you must go, at least take this." He handed me a small, smooth stone with some kind of symbol carved onto it. "Old protection," he said. "Can't hurt." I pocketed the stone, more to be polite than anything else, finished my meal, and headed out. The trail started off easy enough, winding through some beautiful pine forests. But as I got further in, things started to change. The trees got older, for instance, all thick and overgrown. The undergrowth thickened too, making the trail harder to follow and go through. And before long, there was this smell, kind of a musty and sweet smell at the same time, like rotting flowers. It wasn't strong, but it was persistent. I'd been hiking for about 3 hours when I realized I should have reached the lock by now. I checked my map, but I definitely made a wrong turn somewhere. I wasn't seeing any of the landmarks I was supposed to be seeing. I tried to backtrack, but didn't locate anything familiar. Now, get this. As I was walking, the forest was filled with the sounds of nature, and literally, the next single step I took, the moment my foot hit the ground, everything fell silent. That was extremely disturbing. Not too long after, that smell got stronger. I was kind of freaked out. I decided to set up camp for the night right there, and I would get my bearings in the morning. I found a nice open space and got my tent set up just as it was getting dark. That night, I still have nightmares about it. I woke up because I was hearing a whispering sound. At first, I thought it was wind through the trees, but it kept getting clearer until I could hear words that I couldn't clearly make out yet. But it was very obviously multiple voices talking over each other, and they seemed to be getting closer. I double-checked my tent, making sure the zipper was all the way up. I told myself to calm down, that it's nothing out of the ordinary. I then saw shadows on the tent wall, thanks to it being a clear night with a bright moon. Something was moving around out there, and the shapes they cast were wrong. Very tall, very thin, moving in ways that nothing should. I was paralyzed then, just frozen there left to watch. The whispers grew louder, and I could smell that sickly sweet odor right outside the tent. Then something brushed up against the side. I had to bite my lip to keep me from screaming. This went on for a few hours. Sometimes the shadows would retreat, and I would think it was over, but then they'd come back even closer than before. By the time dawn finally came, I was a wreck. As soon as there was enough light out, I packed up my things and started hiking again. This time, I didn't care which direction. I just wanted out. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Around late afternoon, I could hear running water. I pushed through some bushes and found myself on the shore of a loch. But this wasn't the beautiful, peaceful place I'd been told about. The water here was dark, almost black, and there was a very thick mist hanging over it. The trees around the shore were twisted and wrong, their branches reaching out over the water like grasping fingers. And there were stones, standing stones forming a rough circle near the water's edge. They were covered in markings similar to the one on the stone the bartender had given me. As I looked at them, I felt a pressure building in my head, like right before a migraine. I suddenly saw ripples forming on the water's surface, Something was moving around out there. Something big, something coming my way. Before I saw it emerged, I noped out of there. I don't remember much of what happened next. Just crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, that sickly sweet smell all around me. I could hear something moving through the woods behind me too, I swear, but I didn't dare look back. Thank heavens I found my way out somehow. Everything was really just a blur. By the time I came out, I was scratched up and babbling about monsters in the loch. The locals didn't seem surprised. I went back to my hostel, got cleaned up, drank some strong tea. When I finally settled myself down, I went back to that pub to return the stone. When I tried to give it to the old man, he shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "You might need it again someday." I left the Highlands the next day, taking some new lifelong memories and scars with me. Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you're not already, follow and listen to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Leave us a rating while you're at it. Get some cool creepy merch at eeriecast.store. Check out my other show where I narrate scary work stories. It's called Tales from the Break Room. For more terrifyingly entertaining shows from EerieCast, go to eeriecast.com. And if you want to listen to Unexplained Encounters and all the other EerieCast shows without pesky ads, sign up for EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. You'll also get exclusive access to horror audiobooks only available to EerieCast Plus members. And you'll get 20% off our EerieCast.store merch through our members-only monthly discount code. Finally, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.